So there's a great article in NPR today about all the different timeline and reasons for the Ukraine call that Donald Trump had. And so there's one nugget in there that I did not realize. And so when I read it, I was like, oh yes, that makes perfect sense. And almost no one is talking about it. So I've given some NPR some grief in the past because they have developed into way too much conventional wisdom and establishment kind of thinking. And I kid around about how they whisper too much, and they certainly don't like my decibel level. But I love giving credit where credit is due. So this is great work by NPR. So first they go through, and they're not setting it out like this. They just told it in their story of the timeline of what happened and how it happened and why it happened. So I realized in there that there's 4 reasons that Donald Trump made the Ukraine call. 3 of them that you're relatively familiar with. Well, the big one everybody knows is get dirt on political opponent Joe Biden. Okay, so everybody's talking about that. That's what impeachment is about. Okay, then there's 2 other things that we've talked about on the show and others have mentioned, right? One is going back to relitigate the 2016 election, and there's 2 things there. One, he mentioned CrowdStrike. So he has this, and he got asked about this recently, and we showed it to you earlier in the show today. He thinks that there's a secret server in Ukraine that has Hillary Clinton's deleted emails. So, and him and Giuliani think Soros somehow either had the server in Ukraine to begin with, or brought the server from Clinton's New York home to Ukraine, like cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, okay? But that's why he asked about CrowdStrike, et cetera, in the call, and you can see that in the memo. And then related to that, there's a 3rd reason, Paul Manafort. So a lot of the incriminating information about Paul Manafort working with Ukrainian oligarchs obviously came from Ukraine. So another conspiracy theory is that no, Manafort was actually innocent, and the Democrats framed him with false information coming out of Ukraine. That's why Trump is asking the president of Ukraine, hey, can you look to see if the information about Manafort was fake or doctored? Now, what he doesn't realize, because he's not bright, is we already had a trial for Paul Manafort, and in that trial, Manafort actually confessed to and put into the record evidence of the money he got from Ukrainian oligarchs. So it's already been confirmed. Manafort did a plea deal for the 2nd case that he was in. So he submitted that evidence and it matched what investigators had previously thought.
Right.
So thinking that there's some sort of doctored evidence buried in Ukraine is insane in the Ukraine. Also not true, okay? Now that gets to number 4, which is really interesting. Russia wants to basically broker a deal with Ukraine, and apparently Trump has talked about that, not in the call, because we didn't see that in the memo of what transpired in the call, but has told people in the White House, I gotta get Russia and Ukraine to have a deal. Now that overall, that's a good thing. I want people to get along. If it means that we're just breezing past Russia's annexing of Crimea, et cetera, for wrong purposes, then I don't agree. But if Ukraine wants to, I love peace deals, okay? But why? Why does Russia care about that? And then we'll get to why Trump cares about it. Russia cares about it because then it would they would be able to lift the Western sanctions, including most importantly, the US sanctions against Russian oligarchs. If you remember, what was the Trump Tower meeting about? The Trump team kept saying, oh, it's about adoption. No. Russia passed a law saying you're not allowed to adopt Russian kids if you're from the US in retaliation for Western sanctions. So what does Putin and his allies, the oligarchs, want most of all? Lift the sanctions. We froze their money. They want the money, Lebowski. All of this collusion, obstruction, whatever you think happened or didn't happen, but that controversy is around the Russians trying to get anyone in America, and in this case, particularly Trump, to lift the damn sanctions so they can get their money out. So now, apparently Russia has a new tactic, which is let's get Trump to broker a deal we're happy with Ukraine. So we're not actually giving up anything, but we use it to lift the US sanctions because Trump would lift the sanctions on day 1 and he said so. He's like, oh, we gotta have better dealings with Russia and I don't like these sanctions. Even the ones he signed into law, it was because 98 senators voted for it, he knew they could override his veto. And again, he was too unsophisticated to hide that fact. He just said it. He's like, I don't want to sign these sanctions, right. But they're making me, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And then there was the earlier sanctions from before when he came in. So Trump also, in reaching out to the Ukrainians, might be looking out for himself. Now, if the Russians provided as little as a cosign for him on the Deutsche Bank loans or any other loans that he got. He had 6 bankruptcies, couldn't get any major financial institutions to give him loans. He needs someone to cosign the loans, or if the Russians actually gave him the loans, as his own kids have said, well, here would be another reason for Donald Trump to want to tell the Ukrainians, hey, let's make a deal here. You do me a favor, and one of the favors would be to do a deal with the Russians so they can get their money back and they don't hold it over Donald Trump's head. And for the people who said, no, there's no bad relationship or illicit relationship with Trump and Russia, and they said one of the pieces of evidence that they used was, look, Trump gave weapons to Ukraine that Obama was reluctant to give. And so obviously, Trump doesn't mind going against Russian interests. Well, it turns out in the NPR story, they explain that Trump, of course, fought that tooth and nail.
What?
Of course, that was another thing that Congress wanted to do, and Trump would constantly complain, why are we helping the Ukrainians? I mean, we need to have peace with Russia. I don't think this is gonna help our relationship with Russia at all. Oops, there goes one of your critical evidences that Trump is tough on Russia. And here he is now apparently working behind the scenes to help Russia again on the issue of Ukraine.
Okay, so I'm about to speculate a little bit, but I wanna kind of get your thoughts on this. So on one hand, there's this argument that Donald Trump isn't this warmonger and doesn't want to do regime change wars. On the other hand, when you consider his rhetoric in regard to both Venezuela and not North Korea, Venezuela and Iran, like it is kind of strange how he has all this tough guy language, but never pulls the trigger, which thank God he doesn't pull the trigger. Now, when it comes to Venezuela, Russia's an ally. When it comes to Iran, Russia's an ally.
Yeah, that's true. Syria, Russia's an ally.
Yeah,
okay.
Anyway, that's just, I mean, it could just be a coincidence. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, and look, those are relevant factors to consider. But, I like those actions as Anna does. I'm glad he didn't pull the trigger. So even if it's the Russians telling him don't pull the trigger, we dodged a bullet on that because the war in Iran would be disastrous. But it is still unacceptable to have our president controlled by the Russians or any other government if that's the case. But guys, we can solve all of this. We can solve the Russiagate stuff. We can solve all of the different reasons why he called Ukraine. The transcripts, the actual transcripts, not memos, the actual transcripts of these calls are in the secret server that Donald Trump White House put them in. Not only the call with Ukraine, his allies are complaining all over television now, oh, that's not an actual transcript. Great, well, Trump has the actual transcript, give it to us. But also calls with Russia. And so the Russiagate people might be right. Maybe we get those calls, the transcripts of the calls with the Russians. Now that's when you shouldn't be talking about it. He probably talked about it when he refused to have an American translator and he talked to Putin in person.
Right.
But Trump's not that bright. So he might have said it on the phone like he did with Ukraine. And why did he hide him in the secret server if he didn't have to worry about anything he said to Putin? So let's get the actual transcripts, put pressure on whether you're from the left or the right, because if you're on the right or you're on the left and you don't think Russiagate is real, well then those transcripts would prove that Donald Trump is pure as the driven snow and perfectly innocent, that the calls were, as he says, perfect calls, right? Great, show the transcripts.